this. All right.
Right.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Let's do it.
Cool.
Thank you for joining us on The Change Artist, where we bring our listeners stories and great advice for leading and following through change from business leaders who are making a difference in their organizations. Now, here on The Change Artist, our motto is, if change is the only constant in life, then let's do it better. And this season, we're focusing specifically on behavior change, what it means to change behavior on your team and in your organization, and how to actually go about it. So let's jump right in. Chris, how do you define behavior change?
Well, hello, Alyssa, and thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate it. We've been kind of planning this for a while, so I'm excited that we're here. Yes, I think that, when we think about behavior change, what I find in the business world, there's something very specific, which is we want sustainable change. There's a lot of situations where we could possibly change someone's behavior once, but what we're really looking for is we want change that is sustainable over time. And so whether that is a sales situation or if that's an organizational situation, effective change is really about making changes that stick and having people feel motivated to change. And so I think those are two really important parts of it.
Sorry, I lost the mute button. I was like, what? I'm taking a note and I'm also losing all of my momentum. Well done.
Oh,
that's perfect.
That's
now,
how it works.
Right? That's perfect. Now, for those of you who don't know him, Chris Gray is a former psychologist and is passionate and pioneering expert in buyer psychology and purchase behavior. And he's here today to talk to us about how we can apply what he's learned in the consumer behavior space to our organizations and teams. So I want to get back to your definition and dig in a little bit. You mentioned sustainable change. What does it mean for change to be sustainable? What does it mean for change to be sticky?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that you have to realize to really pull this apart and start examining it is that every human behavior happens for a reason, particularly if it's a repeat behavior. So if you are in a situation where either you want to improve behavior, or you want to change something that's negative, one of the first questions to ask, well, what purpose is the behavior serving? Because that ultimately needs to be addressed first. You can make temporary changes, but if those changes aren't meeting the needs of the person that you're trying to change the behavior of, then they're probably going to go right back to what is comfortable and usual for them. There needs to be value attached. That's my dog. Sorry about that. There we go.
This is what editing is for, so no big deal.
That's Helen. It must be the mailman. Sorry about that. I'm just going to go back to behavior change. I think that when we can really understand what's driving behavior in the first place, then we can find ways to meet those needs or those aspirations more effectively, and make that behavior change the path of least resistance, if you will. And so it really is about, how do you add value? How are you meeting needs? How are you helping people achieve their aspirations? Because that is ultimately what's going to motivate that behavior. And if you're not addressing those, then you might be able to change a behavior for a moment, but over time, it will probably go right back to what they're comfortable in have as habits or what's usual for them.
And what is the best way to go about actually sussing out what people's motivations are? I think it's really easy as a manager to think, I have hired these people. I understand what their job is. I must understand what their motivations are. They're just like mine, right? I'm now going to foster behavior. I'm going to encourage them to change their behaviors by treating them the way I would expect to be treated, or with what would work with me.
Yes, that is exactly right. And that is a human tendency. There's actually a word for that, or a phrase for that. It's called naive realism. And the concept of naive realism is that we think our own subjective experience of the world, the things that we like, the way we think, our motivations, are objective reality. And we also think that other people should agree with those because that's reality. And when someone doesn't agree with our subjective reality, we have to somehow explain that away. And so we typically will say, well, they're just uneducated and I need to teach them so that they'll think like me, or they're just being biased, or there's something wrong with them. And so it really boils down to they're either stupid or there's something wrong with them. And like I said, it's something we all do from time to time. I mean, I'm a huge music fan. I have my favorite bands. I have my favorite music. And I have to catch myself sometimes if someone says, oh, I don't like that band. Like, are you crazy? But it's really about being aware that we all do that, and then catching yourself, and being able to realize, okay, they're not me. I may find this important, but maybe they don't. So how can I try to get into their mindset a little bit more? And that's really a good starting point.
And how do you do that without, I think it's really easy to get into this frame of mind that feels almost manipulative. So how do you think about changing behavior, picking up cues from the people that you're trying to help guide through change, speaking to them in a way that works for them without drifting into manipulation and sort of feeling gross?
Well, and it is something that is easy to do, honestly. I think a lot of times, those manipulative ways, I often hear, psychology tricks to get people to do something. And, you can do those things, but in my mind, they don't typically work, not for the long term. In marketing, for example, we're sophisticated enough. We can probably get just about anyone to buy just about anything once. But if that feels manipulative to them, as humans, our first reaction to feeling coerced is resistance. And it's just a natural reaction. We like to have, to feel like we have control over ourselves and have, know what we want to do and are able to take that path on our own versus being persuaded or manipulated. And when we feel that we're being persuaded or manipulated, the first reaction is to resist it. And then if it continues, then you get into frustration, anger, resentment, and finally avoidance. And those are not good, not great things to have in any relationship. And so it really, one of the questions I get all the time is, aren't you just tricking people into buying things they don't want? And I always say, we could do that, but I just don't think it's smart. And it's because what we're looking for is sustainable change over time, not a one-off that results in some other negative reaction.
And does your approach to changing behavior shift if you're trying to change the behavior of others versus if you're trying to change your own behavior?
It has to, because one of the things is we have a lot more access to what's going on in our heads than we do in what's going on in other people's heads. And so, that's really the fundamental attribution error, is the fact that we can explain our own behavior, but when someone else tries to explain their behavior, like let's say you're late for a meeting. Well, if I'm late for a meeting, I know, traffic was terrible. I couldn't get the kids out the door. I could, something like that. If someone else comes in late for a meeting and they start to give me excuses, I'm like, I don't care, you're late. Don't be late next time. Right? Because we think our reasons matter, but other people's reasons we tend to dismiss. And so that is a real watch out for anyone in a leadership position, because if you want to have real change, if you want to have a great relationship with the people that work with or for you, it really starts with setting aside some of your own biases, some of your own prejudices or presuppositions about them, and trying to see their situation through their own eyes, or at least with fresh eyes. Because otherwise, you run into things like confirmation bias, which is a killer in relationships, because you start looking for things to confirm what you already think about them. And generally, if you're looking for something negative about someone, you're probably going to find it. But if you are able to look with fresh eyes, look through their perspective, it just gives you more options for how to deal with that relationship and how to ultimately kind of influence that behavior as well.
When I think about interacting with my own team, I think about trying to come to them with empathy, trying to hear them first, trying not to place sort of my situation on them and assume that their concerns are my concerns. One of the things that I'm struck with as we continue to bring in more diverse folks onto teams that bring really great perspectives is that their experience and the things that influence them are actually further away from the things that influence me. And it's hard for me to bridge that gap on my own. So how, as I look to foster healthy, diverse teams, do I do that and close that gap, or maybe not close the gap, but help people that come from someplace different, that have different sets of expectations? How do I help them, or how do I close that gap with those people on my team?
It's a great question. And it is one that I think all of us struggle with. I think particularly the older I get, the more I struggle with it. One, I'm more set in my ways, and two, it seems like the younger people are further and further away from me. But I think it really, first of all, I think the first thing really is all of us, we need to give ourselves a break. These are natural human tendencies. We all have blind spots. We all have certain prejudices or presuppositions. It's not whether we have them or not, it's how we act on them, or if we act on them, that matters. And so I think when you talk about like, how do I bring that gap together, what I'm thinking, it's more of a, how do I try to understand them so that they're getting what they need from me, right? So that they can be successful, because that's ultimately their success is going to be your success. And so, it starts with one, being aware of your own issues, your own biases, your own prejudices, those types of things, and really be clinical about it. It's not about being self-judgmental. It is about being aware so that you can have options for how to act on those things. And then the next step is be able to set those aside when you engage with your team. So when you're training to be a psychologist, you spend a lot of time examining your own perspective, your own biases, and all of that. And then we learn this little activity that it seems a little silly, but it actually can be really effective, where you think of, before going into a meeting or before meeting with a client, you just think about, your own prejudices or your own presuppositions about that person. And you imagine putting a bracket around that and just setting it aside, so that you can have an opportunity to look with fresh eyes. And it's just a great activity before going into a meeting with someone, particularly if you're going to be in a meeting where maybe there's a heated discussion or something sensitive that you need to talk about. It really just helps to be aware of your own issues and put those aside so that you can engage effectively on their terms. And I think so those two things are really important. From there, first of all, I think spending time with people is so important. I think, we have found many, many ways that allow us to not spend time with people. And some of those are very efficient. Some of those make a lot of things possible that weren't possible before. Like I'm talking to you today. But there is no substitute for spending time with people one-on-one or in groups, because you get much more rich data about them. And you're able to really assess how they operate much more effectively. So you had asked before about, how do you get to know someone's motivations? Well, it starts with spending time with them. And it's hard to just ask directly. You certainly can have those conversations, but I always take those with a grain of salt, because sometimes people aren't very aware of their own motivations. And so it's a mixture of conversation, observation, engagement, interaction, and being able to just kind of see through their perspective, what's important to them, what motivates them, what's going to drive them, what do they get excited about, like when do their eyes light up, and when do they get animated, start talking with their hands like I do when I get excited. Those are the clues that will tell you, what are their motivations, what are their aspirations, and then from there you can say, okay, how can I help them achieve those in the work that we do, in our interactions, because that ultimately is what's going to motivate behavior change.
And when you say spending time, does it have to be time in person? Is there a way to spend time remotely? Like, what is the dynamic in today's environment where some of us are in person,
Yeah.
some of us are remote, some of us are only in person a few days a week. It's some kind of hybrid.
Right.
I think this is a really hard thing to navigate. And I know I'm
It-
looking for tips. So
Really.
lay it
Yeah,
on me.
no, I think of it as on a spectrum or a continuum, really, with kind of at the best end of the spectrum being spending one-on-one time with someone, or time in situations with someone in real life. It really isn't a replacement for that, because it's just a full experience, right? And as you get away from that, you just get a little bit less of that full experience. But I do think, particularly with the advancements in the last couple of years, just based on necessity, right? I mean, that virtual meetings, virtual engagement can be very rich, but it does take a little bit more effort. You have to be more intentional about it. And I think that we shouldn't think of it as a replacement per se for those in-person moments, but something that can really supplement or be a substitute for when that's not possible.
One of the things that I miss when I'm remote is the candid interaction. Hey, let's just walk down, let's go get a soda. Or we're walking to the next meeting, we're going to walk together to the next meeting. Or like, you're going to the next meeting, but I need 5 minutes of your time. Can I walk with you?
Yeah, I think
Some
it's a
of those.
big miss. I mean, you think even in the sales and marketing world, I mean, how many sales have really happened because someone said, "Hey, can I get you for 5 minutes?" And that starts something. And I think that we will find other types of ways as well to augment that, but I think that it would be to our detriment to lose those moments entirely. And that really is one of the things that is really special about real life experiences.
But so for some of us, we're fully remote, so we don't have those in-person interactions except on a very exceptional basis. Others are in a hybrid environment, so half the week they're not in the office. And if we're talking about interacting with customers, for example, those customers, your organization may not be willing to fund travel to the same extent that they used to, because we've now demonstrated we can work remote. And so when we are sort of stuck in a virtual world for whatever period of time, what are the things that we can do to achieve some of the same outcomes as the drive-by in the office?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one. Honestly, a few things that come to mind for me are when you can and when it's appropriate, have time for virtual engagement beyond just the formal meetings. If it can be, hey, we're just going to have, a 15-minute chat about anything or ask me anything. Try to create some spontaneity versus just having agendas, for meetings that you have to get through and everybody's involved and everything. I think that obviously those are important, but also having some time to allow for a little bit more spontaneity can really be helpful.
Nice. And is that time spent together on Zoom, or is that like Teams chats that you set up where it's like, show me what you're cooking?
Yeah.
What have you seen that works?
I think it could be a little of both. The thing that I would say is the more sensory inputs, the better, because that's really how our brains construct memories, is from the sensory inputs that we have. And so if there are more that are available for us to draw from, then those will be more memorable. They'll have more impact. So I love, show me something random that you enjoy. I was on a video podcast a few weeks back, and they had a part about a section about your secret talent. And at first I thought it was silly, but as I thought about it, like, this is really smart. You're just getting like some spontaneous craziness from this person that's going to really tell you about them. And so, they got their money's worth from me, because I can make balloon animals. So, I entertain children at birthday parties. I have been for years. They just, not like I don't get paid for it. It's like for cousins and nephews and nieces and stuff. But yeah, I mean, you learn something when you create those spontaneous moments. It just takes a little more effort in the virtual world. And so, making sure that you set aside time for just casual interaction, something silly, something fun, you're going to learn a lot more than you think from those situations.
Okay, so we've talked about building rapport, building an interaction, building a relationship. setting aside some of your biases so you can be open to receiving what's important to others. We talked about empathy. How do we then turn that into helping drive behavior change in our organizations?
Yes. So I think as we start to go through this, there's actually, I have a step-by-step process. It's 6.5 steps to influencing behavior without feeling gross about it. We've talked about a few of the steps. The first is empathy. And so it is really exactly what we've talked about, addressing your own issues and biases, trying to see from the other person's perspective, spending time with them in some fashion. Then we have to really, if we want to change a behavior, we have to be thinking about, okay, well, what's the behavior that we want, right? Because we need to know where we're going. It's like a map, right? If we're going to go on vacation, we want to know where we're going so that we can get there as efficiently as possible. It's the same way with behavior. So really, the next step is about defining the target behavior. What is it that we want the behavior to turn into? Where is it now? And what is it that we want it to become? And the more specific you can be about that, the better. There's an old saying that, a problem well-defined is a problem half solved. And that really applies here as well. So the more specific you can be about what is the current behavior that's either problematic or that we want to shift, and then what is it? How will I know when we're successful? And what are the markers, the cues that will tell me this behavior has changed?
How do we think about then, I can have a vision for the behavior change I'm looking for. I can try to explain, I can sort of map it out in great detail, explain it to folks, have them adopt the behavior change that I've outlined, and then discover that that was not the behavior that's actually going to drive the outcomes I was looking for.
That is true. And so I think it does take some examination of what is it that you really want? Like, what does that behavior mean to you from your own objective standpoint, from your standpoint? Because I think if that's misaligned, yeah, the behavior may change, but did it actually solve what I'm really looking to solve for? So I think that's a great point. So part of defining that behavior change is, what is it really that this is going to do for me or the organization that will be beneficial?
And how do we deal with then resistance that comes from folks that feel kind of whipsawed?
Yeah.
Change fatigue. You've asked me to do this recurring task 6 different ways in the last 6 months. It was working before, and now it's all kind of broken, and I don't know which one is up. How do we recover from something like that?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of pieces to that question, because if we're in a situation where we've made multiple changes that haven't stuck, we're in a very specific situation there, right? And so we have to really think about and be honest with ourselves about what didn't work and why. And I think, again, this is where things like confirmation bias can really be a problem, because it is hard to examine those situations where we've not been successful. And it is important in those situations that we just really be honest with ourselves about what didn't work and why. But I think if we kind of move along the 6.5 steps, the next 2 are really critical. And I think we'll answer some of your questions as well. So the next one we've talked a bit about, which is the motivation. So why would they want to do this? What's in it for them? So it's about, what is the value for them? Because if they don't see value in this new behavior, they're not going to put the effort into shifting behavior. Because as any of us know, changing our own behavior is hard. If you've ever tried to lose weight or stop smoking or, stop any habit that you have, it's not something that just happens without effort. It is effortful, it's challenging. It can come with a lot of bumps in the road. And so we want to make sure that the person or persons that we want to change their behavior, that they see the value in it for them. What is it that would make them want to do this? So being very clear about that from their own perspective. And a watch out here is, it's not what you think they should want, it's what they actually want. And again, we get into the naive realism, like, oh, well, I would want that, so of course they want that. Let's think about it from their perspective. And then the part that kind of pairs with that is the means. So do they have the means to do this. So making sure they have the tools they need, the situation is set up so that there are not barriers to change for them. So it's really about understanding, why wouldn't this work? What could get in the way for them of making this change? There could be skill sets, there could be perspectives, it could be technology, it could be any number of things that might sort of get in the way that we'd have to address. And so those two together, so motivation and means, really go together. And from those two, that's where you really develop your strategy, because it is, how do we tap into the motivation and ensure that they see the value of the change? And then are we getting anything out of the way that we can control to help make this easier for them?
So when I've done this in the past, the times when I've been most successful is when it's been kind of a collaborative exercise. You know, we've talked about understanding people's motivations. We've talked about like, what are the means that they need to change their behaviors? And sometimes I don't have all the answers. And so making it a conversation, I find, tends to lead to better outcomes, or at least better plans. But sometimes in that collaborative exercise, I meet real resistance, right? And instead of being in a frame of mind that says, okay, we need to make this change, how do we go about that? What is it we need to do? What are the resources we need? It's, you're telling me I need to make this change, but I actually don't believe you. I actually don't want to make this change. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay stuck in all the reasons this is going to fail. As you're in those conversations, how do we go about navigating the pivot from, I'm not interested in this and I'm only going to tell you the things that are wrong, to, here are our challenges and here's how we might remediate them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, it's one of those situations where having training and experience as a therapist really comes in handy, because it's really easy to become reactive in those situations. When someone resists, or, there's often, it's often a charged conversation in some ways. And in a leadership position, it can be really easy to get kind of sucked into that and react emotionally, or react in a way that isn't helpful. But I think when someone's being resistant, the first question should be why. Why are they resisting? And if your answer is, oh, it's just because they're a difficult person, or they don't know, I'm going to ask you to dig deeper, because there's a reason that they're resisting. It could be they just don't see the value of the change. It could be there have been previous changes that they put effort into and just never paid out for them. It could be that, they are, just frustrated with something else, and this is one more thing that they have to deal with. I think really, again, taking that step back and asking yourself, okay, they're clearly resisting this change. What is going on here? Like, what is it that is creating this resistance? And being honest. And I think having conversations, continuing to engage and try to understand where that's coming from. And it's a delicate conversation, because I think if you go straight to, well, why are you resisting? That's not going to help. It's more about, conversations that are empathetic. I know change is difficult, and this might be very challenging. What would make it worth it for you? Or what could make this better for you? And having those conversations. And I can't guarantee that everything will work out perfectly, but that's certainly going to be a better way to deal with resistance than kind of pushing back in that. And then, in the end, at some point, you have to make a decision as an organization, like, how far do we push this? Do we finally just say, bam, this is it, it's happening, so get on board or don't? When do you reach that point? That's a difficult challenge as well.
Yeah. Now, we've had a ton of great advice in this conversation, but I'm going to ask you for one more balloon animal, right? Give me one more piece of advice for our listeners for helping shape behavior on our teams and with our business partners.
I think, I'm trying to think beyond what I've already said, but because I really think that the first thing is be aware of your own biases and challenges. If you can create that awareness, that's going to get you half the way there. It's such an important barrier. It can be such an important barrier. And like I mentioned, things that come from that, things like confirmation bias or naive realism, that just stand in the way of being an effective leader or being able to lead change effectively. So I think it is always really know yourself, think from their perspective, are really the two biggest pieces. If you can do that, that's going to help you work through a lot of big challenges. Not that you won't have challenges, because that's just the nature of being human, but it will help you get through them with more grace, more effectiveness, and hopefully with a team that really appreciates, your willingness to think from their perspective as well. I think that really creates a lot of good, great basis for a effective relationship.
I love it. Well, thank you, Chris. I know I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. Now, if our listeners want to connect with you directly, or if they want to dig a little deeper into those 6.5 steps, how should they go about doing that?
Sure, they can go to my website, which is thebichologist.com, or you can reach out to me directly. It's chris.gray, so it's chris.gray at thebichologist.com. I'm always happy to hear from people and love having these kind of conversations.
Perfect. And we will be sure to include those links in the show notes. I really appreciate your time and perspective here. Hopefully our listeners can take your advice and apply it to their own teams. Now,
thanks so much, Alyssa.
Thank you so much. Now, if any of our listeners would like to bring these kinds of conversations to their own organizations, you can visit us at blueswiftconsulting.com to schedule an intro call. Thanks again, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.